Hi, I'm Dan.
And I'm Nathan, and we are DKNG Studios. We are a design and illustration firm based in California. We work with a range of clients, including bands, breweries, corporate brands, and because of that, we often need to make changes, make revisions, and prepare work for a wide range of different mediums, including screen printing is one that we do a lot. Because of that, working with vector files has really become the quickest and easiest way that we know how to work. We also collaborate with each other quite a bit and are often passing files back and forth. So working in Illustrator has really become the centerpiece of everything that we do. So in this session, we wanted to kind of show some behind the scenes of some of our actual Illustrator files, how we set them up, some of our favorite tips and techniques that we use in Illustrator, and also some of the newest tools that we are starting to use. So I'm going to kick things off by kind of showing how we start a new project in Illustrator, and later Dan will jump in and share some of the techniques that he uses as well. So for this example, I'm going to be using an enamel pin that we did. We created this succulent series of prints and enamel pins, and like with many of our projects, we started this with a pencil sketch. So many times it can be really daunting for me to jump in and try to just start with a blank artboard. So we try to always put pencil to paper first, and it's just a much easier way to kind of kickstart the project once you get it into the computer. So I brought in this pencil sketch, put it on its own layer that I called sketch, and now I'm going to add a new layer called art and place that on top. It might be counterintuitive because what it means is that when I start drawing now, I'm going to be covering up my sketch, which is obviously not helpful. So if we click this layer targeting button right here, what I can do is go over to my transparency palette and set that to multiply. And now anything I do on this layer, within the layer itself, it's going to act normally, but the entire layer is multiplying onto the layer below, and that'll be an easy way to work from my sketch as I draw. Global colors is the next thing I wanted to touch on because it's something that also allows us to work a lot more quickly. Before we use this tool, the much slower way that I was using to get around changing colors in a file was using the select same fill color or select same stroke color. The problem with that is it can be really tedious, and if that color is also in a gradient or being used in text or something, you're not always finding that color in your file. So the way this works is I just have these three swatches here, select new color group, and I'm creating from the selected artwork, convert process to global, and that's the most important thing. Once I do that, it's creating this new folder of swatches down here, and the nice thing is that let's say I'm using this yellow color, wherever I use that yellow in my file, whether it's a fill or a stroke or anything else for that matter, as long as I'm using that global color, once I select that in my swatches, I can adjust it here and it's going to change everything in the file, so I don't need to rely on digging through the file to find those. If we come over here, this is the actual file that we ended up using to produce these pins, and just to show how we might use that in a real-world scenario, let's say we wanted to change this copper metal color to a silver. What I can do is double-click that swatch, adjust that color, and once I turn on preview, you can see that now I've changed that instance in every part of the file. Another thing that I did is over here, if I Control Z back, I was also using that copper color in a gradient and in live text. And if you've ever had this issue before, you go to change text color and it changes everything as opposed to just that selection. So again, the nice thing about global colors is when you're changing it in the swatch, it's changing it in just that part of the gradient, in just that part of the text. So it's kind of a foolproof way to quickly work with color. Lastly, I just want to touch on the Pathfinder tool. This is another way to work really quickly in Illustrator, and especially for me, I'm not much of an Illustrator by hand, I like working with geometry instead. So this is a nice way to combine shapes, separate shapes, and some of the features that I use most are this Unite tool here to just combine shapes together. As far as building other shapes from that, let's say I was working on the flower from that succulent pin, this right here, the crop tool, is a nice way to just get the yield from two shapes overlapping, and that could become part of a flower. Another one that I like to use a lot is the divide tool, just to break things up, get to all the specific shapes. Sometimes that's a nice way to help you see what you're working with and find all the pieces, especially if you're preparing for something like screen printing. And then kind of an alternate way of using that tool is this trim tool, where almost the same as the divide, but it's going to prioritize the front shape. So in this case, this more magenta circle was untouched. It just cut out from the back shape. Now that we've talked a bit about file setup, I'm going to turn it over to Dan to get into some other Illustrator tools.
I'd like to talk about adding more realism within Illustrator. With Photoshop, you can get a very realistic look, but you're limited in terms of rasterizing. But with the vector shapes in Illustrator, you have a lot more flexibility, and a lot of people don't realize how much realism you really can get within the program. So right now I have a file open for a gig poster we created for Mumford & Sons, and you can see how realistic we really can get using only vector shapes. So you can see within our Illustrator file that we have this rocky texture going on, and that's within Illustrator, but it's linking to an actual rastered image. So I'm going to show you how we create that in Photoshop. So I'm going to go ahead and open up this file, which is a rock texture. And the way we get something like this to work with ease within Illustrator is that we turn it into a bitmap TIFF. So right now it's just a raster JPEG. It's at grayscale, which is important. You want it to actually be at grayscale. If it was anything else, we would have limitations in terms of how we can colorize it in the end. So what I'm going to do is bitmap it. And I like to kind of keep things pretty high in terms of their pixel per inch. So I'm going to say 600 and have a diffusion dither. This allows as much detail as possible within the Illustrator file. And I'm going to save it as a TIFF. Right now it's already in the file, but I'm going to go ahead and place another version of it on the outside of our artboard here. And you can see it's on this gray background. You can't really see it that well because it starts off black. But what's nice about something that's grayscale is that you can change its color. So we already have our swatches here, and I can change it to white if I want to. What's nice about it not being a JPEG and actually being a TIFF is that its background is transparent. So you can see that we're seeing through to the background here, which is gray. And as I go over the file, it actually will give texture to the file as well, keeping in mind the background color. Now, you're not just limited to this binary idea of one color texture on top of another background. You can use a technique called multicolor textures using opacity masks. This is something we recently discovered, which has been super helpful in order to get a little bit more realism and also just more variety in terms of colors. So right now I'm using this TIFF, but if we were to relink this to what we originally had, which was this rock JPEG, which remember is still grayscale. So as it's grayscale, you can see what's happening is anything that was black is now this yellow color, and anything that was white is actually going to stay white. But what I'd like to do is actually make it black again, and then I'm going to go ahead and create a gradient. This gradient could be anything you'd like. I'm going to go ahead and make it two colors. So it's dealing with yellow on one side and green on the other. And I'm going to set it to the back so that's behind this texture. And it's important that the texture is a JPEG in this technique. So what I'm going to do is select both objects, and then I'm going to go in the transparency area and select Make Mask. Now what that does is that it uses the texture itself as a way of clipping the gradient. Right now It's basically utilizing the white as the area that we see, but you can invert this. So I'm going to go ahead and click the invert mask. And you can see what happens is we have something similar to what we were using before, but this time it's actually using multiple colors. So this can be super helpful if you want to have like a sunset of textures going on so that it eventually kind of fades to something that's a little bit more subtle in the end. So we can start off going, let's say yellow and then green to the top. So this gives you a bit more flexibility. It's just a couple more steps, but it's super useful in terms of realism. Another way we add realism to our work is using gradients, and not just your standard gradients, but using specifically the freeform gradient. You can see our file here is using a standard gradient where it's going from green to yellow, kind of creating this sunset look. But what's neat about the freeform gradient is that you have way more variety in terms of how you can make it look. So I'm going to go ahead and create a shape here, and I'm going to press in the gradient area the freeform gradient selection. And what this will do is it will start these little nodes that you can individually click and change their color. So let's say I want one of these to be white and one of these to be yellow. And all of a sudden we have something that is way more complex than what a normal gradient tool can do. And what's also neat is that each individual one of these can actually be changed in terms of their transparency. So I can customize these and make like 0% opacity. Other ones can be 25%. This one could be like 50. And you can even add more if you'd like. So I'm already getting something just that's a little bit more organic and way more customizable. And what I can do is then select this item and place it in my file. I'm going to go ahead and place it in front of this gradient here, but behind these mountains. So now you can kind of see we're getting a little bit more variety here. And if you want to customize it even further, just go to your toolbar and select the gradient tool, and these nodes will pop up again. And it's kind of nice that even after you make it, you have the flexibility of moving them around to a point where it just kind of feels a bit more organic and like it's working with your existing illustration. So the freeform gradient tool has a large variety of uses, and we find that it really helps with photorealism.
So one other thing I wanted to touch on is working with type in Illustrator. And actually the new beta build of Illustrator has some cool new features specifically for working with type and how to align type. One thing that is a bit more like InDesign and a nice feature to have is that previously we were able to do paragraph alignment horizontally but not vertically. So now there's this new area type feature where instead of just having text aligned to the top of our paragraph text box, we can also do centering and even vertical justification. And this new area type tool has lots of options as well, so that's great. One other thing that's really cool is now that this new build of Illustrator is recognizing not just the text box, but the actual edges and anchors of the type itself. So it used to be that if I wanted to center this text within this box, I would usually convert the text to outlines first and then center it, knowing that it's actually taking the shapes into consideration. But the downside is that that text is no longer live. Fortunately, with this new method, it's not recognizing the text box, it's recognizing the actual shapes that the type is made of. So it's actually centering it for real. Those all come in really handy for something like this, which is a project that we did designing a deck of playing cards. And as you can see, this is the tuck case, the outer box that the cards go into. And a lot of it has to do with aligning text, placing it in containers, and then customizing that text for kind of a more complete look. And these new type tools are perfect for this type of application. And it goes as far as, because of this recognition, now when you're using smart guides, you can actually snap to things like the baseline of the text, and it'll actually point out here that you're locked to the baseline, or even the X height. You can snap right to these anchors that are at the X height of the text. So really easy to align text while you're still keeping it live. One other technique I used in this example was started off with a font for this playing card text, but knew that I wanted it to occupy this full frame. So in this case, I actually ended up redrawing this type using strokes, and you can see here how that type is actually just strokes. And what that allowed me to do is go in and adjust the height of these letters and customize them. And as you can see, even just something like that, you can really create a lot of different variations and make something very custom. Now there's also a built-in method of doing that in Illustrator a bit, which is using variable fonts. And the nice thing about that is that it's also going to take some of the nuances of the font into consideration. So it's not just going to thicken or lighten a font the way that you would if you added a stroke to it. It's going to do it in a more proper way. So for example, as I add weight to this font, you can see some of the letter forms change a bit. It's adding some, overall the area it takes up is getting wider, the spacing is getting tighter. So one way I like to use this is actually also in a project like this example where I know that it's going to be printed using a foil stamp with letterpress printing. Sometimes you can have that font close up a little bit on you, and we want to make sure that all of our counters, like this counter of the A, stay visible. So one way to do that is to work with the variable fonts, and maybe I might just lighten up the weight slightly if I know that that's going to bleed a bit when it prints and gets a little bit bigger, so that your end result will print how you want it to. Now here's Dan again to talk about patterns in Illustrator using this specific can as an example.
Man, gross, Nathan. During a pandemic? Ugh. Hold on a second. All right, well, let's get started talking about patterns in Illustrator.
More specifically, more complex patterns like tessellations. A tessellation is what we see from M.C. Escher, where one shape, let's say the shape of a lizard, will actually equal itself into a puzzle shape, and you can repeat that shape over and over again until you have like a pattern. And we created this look for this project for Almanac Beer Co. This can actually shows a tessellation of dogs. And we got pretty complex with it where every little element kind of equals something else next to the dog next to it. So the tail equals a collar and so on. We even changed its orientation so that some dogs are looking left, some dogs are looking right. And it's kind of complex on how you make it, but I just wanted to show you a quick way how to make a simple tessellation. Right now I have a cube, more specifically an isometric cube, and you can make this into a tessellation pretty quickly by using the pattern tool. So you want to go to Object, Pattern, Make, and you can see that it basically starts to create a pattern using this. What's nice about this is right now it's kind of gridded like blocks next to blocks, but you have this tile type where you can actually brick things out. So another thing you want to keep in mind is this gap needs to be closed here, and this can be adjusted by adjusting the height. So I'm going to start closing that gap by making that height a little smaller. This is where kind of the math comes in. You can see that I have a little small gap here still, and I'm not really sure what the measurement needs to be, so I have to actually look at the measurement of my shape itself. So what it's looking for is the height of one of these sides to actually make it link up. And you can see if I select these two red shapes, the height is 1.732, and if I actually update this number right here, 1.732, it'll close that gap. So I'll go ahead and just say done. And I created this actual pattern in my palettes. So I can go ahead and just create a shape and fill it. And just like that, we have a pretty simple tessellation pattern. Now, when it comes to more complex tessellations like this dog pattern, we actually use a different tool within Illustrator. It's called the Global Edit tool. I'm going to show you how changing one feature on a dog will actually change all the features and all the dogs surrounding it. So this is one shape that is identical to all these other shapes. And the way it was created was just pushing and pulling one side and another side until everything kind of like links up. So to show you an example of that, I'm going to go ahead and select one dog and click Start Global Edit. And you can see if I update the snout right here and kind of give it some extra rounding, all the dog snouts change. One thing to keep in mind is you want to do the same thing to the area that is below it, because basically its knee also equals its snout on the other dogs. So I'm just going to go ahead and make that change in 2 areas to make sure that it links up. Now, I'd like to talk about isometric illustration. This illustration we created for the UN is an example of this. You can see it's very useful in creating an illustration of cities. And a quick way to describe how it's created is everything has to use these very specific angles that are all created with hexagons. These angles that are created with a hexagon easily will create an isometric cube. We've seen this earlier when I created a pattern using this shape. We're actually going to use this exact shape and that pattern throughout this illustration. And to start off, I'm going to create a custom grid that'll help you get started. So go ahead on your artboard and create a box and fill it with that pattern that we created earlier. You also want to expand this out so it's no longer a pattern fill, and go to Pathfinder and divide it. What this will do is will turn all these shapes into individual shapes. And then one last step is a quick little Command 5, and that will turn all those shapes into a custom guideline. Now, once you have this over your artboard, this becomes super useful in terms of drawing over it and creating your illustration from scratch, but you have a guideline to work with. Now you can see when I draw over it, it's super useful when it comes to creating very angular shapes. Right now I'm just going to create a quick skyscraper, for example. I can just follow the grid and voila, I have basically a taller cube, which essentially is a skyscraper. Now, when it comes to more complex shapes, let's say ones that use circular elements or anything that's a little bit more curved, it's a little more complicated on how you would draw this within this grid because everything is gridded out in these hard angles. So I'm going to show you a little technique that we use when it comes to something a little more complex. So right here we have the rounded windows I'd like to put onto this skyscraper right here. So if you go to Effect, 3D, and go to Rotate, this is a quick and easy way to actually rotate it to the actual angle that you want. And what's really nice about the positioning is that there's actually a position for isometric. And you can go ahead and see that when I line it up with the building, it has the same exact angles as the building. And I can just duplicate this if I'd like and repeat it down the facade of the building to create a series of windows. But the 3D Rotate tool is super useful when it comes to angling more complex circular elements. Now, let's say we'd like to use the 3D tool even further and create something that's even more three-dimensional, not just a facade of a window, but something that actually has some depth. Right here we have a car that we created within this illustration, and it's using the 3D Extrude and Bevel tool to actually create this three-dimensional look. It's not like we made it completely from scratch using our grid. We actually created it using a facade of a car and gave it depth. So what we can see here is how it started. Like, this is the basics of it. What I'm going to go ahead and do is bring that into the illustration to show you how we created it. So you want to go to Effect, 3D, and Extrude and Bevel. Right now what happens is the default will actually give it a pretty deep depth and has a very specific angle, but we want to be more specific in terms of its isometric angle. So if you go to Position, you can go to Isometric Left, it snaps it into this specific isometric grid. And we can update the extrude depth of this, and you can see that I can make it as skinny or as wide as I'd like. Let's go with like 6 points, for example. I'm gonna go ahead and press OK. Now, right now it's kind of live, and you can update this within the appearance panel, but I'm gonna go ahead and expand it, and this will allow me to customize the colors of each facade if I'd like to. And you can go ahead and add windows or more details from here, but this is a great way to get the basics of a shape of a car and add detail as you'd like afterwards. Now there's one more feature within the 3D tools that I'd like to show you. It's called 3D Revolve. has a very specific trait where it takes an object, let's say one side of an object, and wraps it around in a circle, basically creating a cylindrical look. So I have a beach scene within our illustration here, and I'd like to add a lighthouse. Right now, on the outside of my illustration, I have basically a flat version of this lighthouse that I'm imagining. And I purposely made it into two sides. You basically want to only wrap one side for this type of illustration, and I'll show you why. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this side, and it's grouped together. I'm going to go ahead and press Effect 3D Revolve. And you can see, using this tool, what it does is it revolves around itself and creates this cylindrical look. And again, you can update its angles, but specifically position it to isometric left, and all of a sudden it has this angle of our illustration that we like. Now that we've covered 3D tools in Illustrator, here's Nathan to wrap things up.
Thanks again for joining us for this Adobe Max session today. We hope you enjoyed learning about how we use Illustrator and hope you'll find some of these techniques useful. We also have this cheat sheet of some of our most commonly used keyboard shortcuts. You can also download that from our website. And our website, dkngstudios.com, has other great learning resources, and you can find out about the other kinds of work that we do. And lastly, if you want to keep in touch, you can find us at DKNG Studios on pretty much all social media. Thank you again for joining us today, and hope you enjoyed the session.